Hi guys, this is the third lecture of Global Environmental Governance, looking at the importance of states. So the first question we pose is, why are states important? Well, they're important because they're the only actors that can enter into legally binding international treaties. They are the ones that are responsible for enforcing international legal rules. For the most part, they are often delegated authority by international organizations to enforce any legal rules that have been negotiated internationally. They are also the ones responsible for implementing policy domestically because they are the only legitimate actors with coercive capacity to set domestic rules and enforce them through fines or punishment or incentives. They are also the major funders of international environmental organizations and projects. Finally, they can control trade of products that come inside their borders through regulations, tariffs, quotas, and other barriers. It's sometimes fashionable to talk about NGOs or corporations as being the major players in the international environmental space, but really states are the most important actors at the end of the day. The second question we pose is, where do state interests come from? The simplest argument comes from Detlef Sprints and co-author Laura Torranta that we can look at the combination of a state's material interest in environmental protection looking at two factors. One is, what is the physical vulnerability to the impacts of that environmental problem? Are they high? Are they low? Second dimension is, what are the costs for the country of addressing that environmental problem? Are they high or are they low? So to the extent that it faces low costs of addressing a problem, but high vulnerability to the issue, we might think of those as pusher states that are going to be highly motivated. To the extent that it faces low vulnerability and high costs of addressing an issue, we might anticipate that a state will be a dragger and unlikely to address environmental issues. And to the extent that there are more mixed cases where it faces high vulnerability and high costs, it may be more intermediate, where they have cross-cutting pressures. And then there are other cases where it faces, say, low vulnerability and low costs of addressing the problem, and it may be blasé about addressing the environmental problem, a bystander. These aren't the only sources of environmental preferences. They may come from the degree of political mobilization and awareness of the public, so there may be societal factors. There may be the political balance between environmental groups and, say, business groups, which may also factor into domestic decision-making. There may also be elements of political structure that are important. Again, we can think about treaty ratification requirements or political systems in which political parties are able to exercise their vote, voice, and environmental preferences in government through, say, parliamentary systems and Green parties. There may be other reasons, but these are among the main ones. The third question we talked about is Johannes Urpelainen's book about changes in global environmental governance over time. And in the classic global environmental governance in the mid-20th century through the 1970s, 1980s, there were a handful of countries that had the power to destroy, that had expansive impact on the environment that crossed international borders. These included the United States, Europe, and Japan. So it was a limited number of actors, and what they had in common was strong enforcement capability, since all were advanced, industrialized countries that were relatively wealthy, and they were capable of enforcing rules about the environment inside their territories. They also broadly shared a commitment to environmental protection. They all reached sort of level of post-materialism in which environmental values were important to their societies, and they were motivated to address the negative effects of modern capitalism. So what's changed, however, in the contemporary era of the 2000s is the presence of many more states with the power to destroy, namely China, India, middle-income countries like Brazil, other countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Indonesia, countries with large populations with increasing consumptive possibilities given their wealth. And so that means that there are many more actors present. In addition, you also have challenges that they have weaker attachments to environmental protection. They are less interested in it. They have other priorities, namely economic development, as a major goal to advance the well-being and health and wealth of their citizens. First and foremost, with environmental considerations secondary or tertiary. So in addition to many more actors, you also have new actors with weaker environmental preferences. The third aspect that's new and different is that these countries lack the same bureaucratic capacity as the advanced industrialized countries. They may have weak fledgling or non-existent environmental ministries with more limited capacity to enforce regulations on their societies and exercise both oversight and monitoring and punishment for law breaking. So putting these pieces together, you have more actors with the capacity to destroy, weak environmental preferences, and weaker state capacity and implementation capabilities. And that all bodes ill for realizing legally binding international instruments to regulate international environmental problems, and maybe puts a premium on different kinds of more flexible approaches or more limited agreements among a handful of countries that have shared interests or alternative arrangements. And perhaps a change in the orientation in thinking about different kinds of environmental problems. So to the extent that these rising developing countries have an interest in environmental protection, it has more to do with an interest in so-called brown issues as opposed to green issues. Brown issues are issues that have more direct impacts on human well-being, like air pollution, water pollution, maybe soil degradation. Whereas green issues, which tend to be classic wildlife and habitat conservation, and maybe even extend to issues like climate change, these issues are the ones that advanced industrialized countries were and remain interested in. But developing countries, to the extent that they have environmental preferences, they have more to do with these brown issues as opposed to green issues. And to attract their interest in environmental protection, other countries may have to pivot and emphasize the benefits these countries might receive from environmental protection for human health, human well-being, for those suite of brown issues. And that may mean that green issues have to give way, at least in an international agenda setting, to brown issues, or that green issues have to be attached to brown issues as co-beneficiaries oriented around brown issues first. The next issue I wanted to address is the importance of particular countries, starting with the United States. So why is the US important? Well, for one, it is the largest economy in the world and has had the largest historic environmental footprint based on its consumptive patterns. It's a very large per capita user of different resources, and historically has been the largest cumulative emitter, for example, of greenhouse gas emissions since the turn of the industrial era. So the US has an outsized environmental footprint, given its consumptive capacity as a very rich country. It has also had a leadership tradition on some environmental issues, so what the US decides to do or doesn't do can have a bearing on the efficacy and success of international efforts. It has also got the largest, most well-financed environmental lobby in the world, so those groups are very well organized, both domestically and internationally, and can support efforts around the world. It also is a major source of scientific and technological innovation. So the US has been, however, an inconsistent leader on global environmental issues. It was historically a leader in the 1970s. Maybe it's become more inconsistent over time, or perhaps has even experienced a secular decline in leadership over the past 30 years. This oscillation in leadership from the US often takes on a partisan quality, so that when a Democrat leads the executive branch, you get more pro-environmental positions, and when a Republican president is in the White House, there are less environmentally supportive positions. And in explaining why this has occurred, we might emphasize the declining ownership of environmental issues among Republicans, that the Democrats increasingly are the ones that own environmental issues. And given the structure of the US political system, it's rare for the Democrats to exercise unified control of the executive branch as well as both chambers in Congress. We might also emphasize the strangeness of the US treaty ratification system, which typically requires 60 votes in the Senate for advice and consent for a treaty to be ratified. We might go further and note that the US has what we might say is a fatter tail of pro-sovereignty minded senators, so it's very easy to block treaty ratification in the Senate. We might also emphasize that the US political system has two main political parties, whereas in Europe you have small parliamentary parties that can cater to green interests and get a number of seats in parliament and even become swing coalition members in governing parties. So that creates a clearer electoral incentive for politicians to attend to environmental interests, whereas in the US, environmental interests are diluted among a wider set of other issues. If we think that the U.S. has experienced a secular decline in interest in environmental protection, it may reflect changes in the political balance of power between environmental groups and business elites, which may have become more hostile to environmental protection. There are some arguments out there that say that the nature of international environmental regulation has changed over time, so that the issues that are being regulated now creates more costly obligations for the U.S. relative to other countries. There also might be an argument about a sort of life cycle of regulations, that early on there are a few regulations, then an issue becomes well regulated, and then there's a natural cycle of pushback, and the U.S. is just got started early, and therefore that's the reason why it's already moved into this kind of pushback phase, and maybe other polities like the European Union are just further behind, and maybe they have yet to experience that pushback against regulation. So we've argued that the U.S. is an important state in the international system, but it's an inconsistent leader in international environmental issues. Raises the question, under what conditions does the United States lead in international environmental problems? Well, we've seen on some occasions that the U.S. might lead when it perceives itself to be vulnerable to international environmental impacts, namely the ozone hole was a good example when those impacts were very clear and the United States rallied around that and led the world. The second is if there's a settled domestic consensus and domestic law internally. So again, the ozone case is another example. The United States, under those conditions, might be motivated to internationalize its domestic policy, particularly if it's fearful that the cost it's imposed on its own domestic business interests might cause them to lose competitiveness vis-a-vis other companies from other countries. So if those companies from other countries don't have to abide by regulations that the U.S. has imposed on its own companies, it could be at a competitive disadvantage. So it might want to internationalize those domestic legal rules. It may also be possible for the U.S. to lead when there isn't an active business group that's affected by the international environmental problem. Take the case of whaling, in which there wasn't in the 1970s, 80s, a large U.S. whaling industry that was affected by international legal rules addressing whaling, so environmental groups had a kind of open door, or wind at their backs, if you will, to be able to pursue environmental protection. It's also possible that the U.S. might be motivated to address international environmental problems when other countries' environmental practices negatively affect Americans, and that may be similar again to the ozone case. We might think of other cases like fishing and other actors being irresponsible, and that maybe contaminants end up in, say, fish, so the U.S. might be interested in international legal rules to protect its citizens from harm in that way. We also drew attention to another state in the international system, which is China. So what is there to be said about China's role in the international environmental space? Well, for one, China's environmental footprint has grown dramatically as their wealth and consumption have increased. China, for example, eclipsed the United States in 2006 of being the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And given that they have a large population and their wealth has grown over time, their capacity to destroy, if you will, has grown. Now, obviously their per capita emissions and their cumulative emissions over time, for example, of greenhouse gases are smaller than the United States, but still, China's consumptive capability has increased and their environmental footprint has as well. And we observed that not only in pollution that comes from, say, greenhouse gases, but it's also observed in the production and use of materials like steel and cement, where the amount of steel that China produced was about half the world's total in the mid-2010s. And the amount of cement that the Chinese used to support their domestic build-out of infrastructure in a handful of years was as much as the U.S. had used in its previous 100 years. So China's environmental footprint has increased dramatically, and that's also observable in consumption of soy and beef and fish, with international impacts on resources around the world. At the same time, China has become the leading producer of clean energy technologies, including renewables, wind, solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles. China's becoming the major deployer of those technologies domestically, but it's also selling them around the world and investing in clean energy manufacturing facilities. The consequence of massive deployment of those technologies at home has brought the prices of those technologies down dramatically, making it more affordable for other countries to acquire them. But at the same time, China's manufacturing poses difficulties for other countries because China makes more than enough, say, solar panels, EVs, batteries, and turbines that it can use domestically, and it's able to export them. And there are worries that China's economic system of state intervention and state subsidy is unfair to the productive capacity of other countries. And there's a fear that China's companies pose a competitive threat to other countries' domestic industries. There are also real questions about China's commitment to environmental protection at home. Again, its greenhouse gas emissions have risen dramatically, and they still haven't peaked yet, although they might have in the last year or two. China had a reputation for being terribly dirty 10 or 15 years ago. China's air quality has since subsequently improved considerably, which is a function of its kind of version of authoritarian environmentalism, where if China wants to reduce its emissions of pollution in a particular space, it's able to tell producers to stop, and it can impose those rules because it is not a democracy. At the same time, it has been somewhat receptive to the environmental interests of its citizenry, maybe for wider government legitimacy. The Chinese public lacks an ability to express themselves freely in most areas. For a while, the environment used to be something of a safe space for them to do that, although I think that's decreased. The upshot of all these observations is that there remain real questions about China's commitment to environmental change, given the size of its greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in the climate space. That's important. So the choices that China makes or doesn't make in the coming years will increasingly shape the prospects for environmental protection on the global level, but also have major implications for other countries' ability to make a clean energy transition as well.